Gavin Shatkin is our guest visiting for one of the interdisciplinary positions in Smart and Sustainable Cities from the University of Michigan. And if you want to share any more of your background than that, it's up to you. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out. So I'm Gavin Shatkin, and visiting from the University of Michigan. I am in the Associate Professor of Urban Planning there in the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. I've actually had a chance to meet most of you, so I won't go into any more depth than that. You know a little bit about me. So I'll just kind of jump right into my talk, which is I wanted to talk a little bit about some research that I've been doing recently. The title of my talk is Planning Privatopolis, Urban Integrated Mega Projects and the Transformation of Asian Cities. This is a current research project that I am working on a book manuscript on this in the early stage of drafting chapters. The topic is looking at large-scale, privately built or built in a commodified fashion, new urban districts or city-scale or urban district-scale urban developments, very large real estate development projects. I'm using the somewhat clunky term urban integrated mega projects here. This refers to, again, large-scale integrated projects in the sense that they contain residential, commercial, office, industrial space in what is conceived as a kind of a new city within the city. And so I'll begin my discussion, and these things are popping up all over Asia, and pretty much every major city in Asia. I'll talk about a number of examples during the talk. So I'll begin by talking briefly with reference to an example, which is Kolkata West International City, the gate that you see in the image here. And so in February of 2006, the Salim Group, an Indonesian developer, broke ground on Kolkata West International City in the district of Howrah, about 20 miles outside of Kolkata, India, what used to be known as Calcutta. This was to be a self-contained new town of 36,000 residents. It was to contain townhomes and single-family houses set along tree-lined streets, carefully manicured public parks, a 200-bed hospital, schools, a high-rise office park, and a shopping and entertainment complex. One of the first elements of this project to be completed was a gate that you see here that obviously signals this project's global aspirations. This gate was supposedly modeled on Berlin's Brandenburg Gate. Now, this particular project has run aground. It hasn't made much progress for reasons that I'm not entirely sure about, perhaps poor sales of units, perhaps an issue over land acquisition. I'm not entirely sure. Nevertheless, viewed in the context of Kolkata's current urban form, characterized as it is by an intense mix of land uses, integration of the wealthy and the poor at the neighborhood scale, and the prevalence of daily appropriations of urban space. You know, this kind of image we have of, you know, proliferation of informal or squatter settlements, people illegally occupying public space for housing, for vending, for other purposes. This carefully planned and regulated commodified project represents a dramatic reconceptualization of this particular city. This project raises questions, I think, about what such a commodified model of planning at such a scale means for the city as a whole. And I think its failure raises questions about the fate of these kind of profit-driven visions of urban change. Now, Calcutta West International City is but a minor example of, again, this phenomenon that's taking place in so many Asian cities, Jakarta, Manila, Bangkok, in a very different way, and I'm nervous about talking about China with Suzanne in the room, but in China it's a different phenomenon of really state-owned enterprises are building projects that are very much commodified and to a certain degree profit-driven. But in India, in Mumbai, in Bangalore, even in smaller places like Vientiane, Laos, you're seeing these very large-scale projects at least being conceived. And so what I really see is a potentially transformative moment in Asia's urban development. Now, there's a long history of new town development in many societies in Asia, Korea, India, Hong Kong, for example. But what I'm arguing is that there's a new kind of flavor to these new towns that we're seeing today. Much like the old new towns, they're again, they are integrated. They are conceived as these self-contained urban entities containing residential, commercial, office, industrial space, university campuses, hospitals, convention centers, a variety of urban functions in what is conceived as a self-contained city within the city. But differently, they're global in their orientation. They're marketed towards a globalized elite class and towards multinational corporations. Most importantly and most interestingly from the perspective of the research that I'm doing now, again, they're commodified or privatized. They're built on a for-profit basis largely. So they represent an unprecedented role for profit-oriented actors, usually a single private developer. Sometimes they're built through a kind of a public-private partnership in shaping development at an urban and a regional scale. A shift from the modernist state-driven agenda that we've historically seen in new town development, and an attempt to redefine the urban experience through profit-oriented development. Let me briefly talk about a couple of examples of these projects to give you a sense of what we're talking about here. This is a bit hard to see, but it's Bonifacio. It's a rendering of Bonifacio Global City. This is a project in central Metro Manila, an outgrowth of the existing central business district, 200 hectares of land. That's about the size of Central Park. This was land that was sold by the Philippine government to a consortium of private developers in 1998. Master plan for 200,000 eventual full-time residents and 500,000 daytime shoppers and workers. So a major new outgrowth of the CBD. And this is currently being developed. The final of the three examples I'll start out with is Hanoi North. This is obviously being built north of, or it was conceived for north of Hanoi. This is about 7,500 hectares of land that was master planned by the Daewoo Corporation, a Korean conglomerate, master planned for an eventual population of about 750,000 people. So more than the city of Boston plopped down outside of Hanoi. Now this project has not made any forward progress and most likely never will. It is simply foundered. So I think these brief examples give you a sense of the kind of potentially transformative impact that these projects could have. They have the potential to reshape the dynamics of urban and regional development, to introduce new types of urban space based on international models of architecture and urban planning, and they raise new issues of governance. But there are 2 points about the projects that I mentioned that I want to highlight because they're important to the story that I want to tell about these projects. The first is that 2 of the 3 projects that I've mentioned have not made any forward, or have made only minimal forward progress. And so for me, what that means is that we're still at a moment where many decisions are yet to be made, and the actual impact of these projects on urban development is yet to be determined. The second point I want to make is that in each, and I wasn't able to kind of get into this, but in each of the cases that I've mentioned, the state plays a critical role in these projects. The state plays a role in selling land to private developers, in facilitating the transfer of land to private developers, in deregulating in order to allow this to happen, in building infrastructure, providing various forms of subsidy, in being boosters for these projects. And so while I've characterized this as a privatized model of urban development, I nonetheless see it as a critical state strategy for urban change in the current era. And again, that's important to what I'm going to say about these projects because I am an urban planner, and I'm very much concerned about the role of the state and the role of planning in these projects. Now, my interest in these projects stems from concerns over their potential negative impacts. And we hear a lot from the boosters of these projects about their potential positive impacts in terms of economic growth, in terms of bringing new technologies to bear and the kind of ingenuity of the private sector to bear on urban development. But they raise significant concerns about a variety of factors. First of all, displacement. Inevitably, there are people living where these projects are supposed to be built. And there's often large-scale displacement, and this is sometimes violent. So to give one example, I visited a community adjacent a new rail station that had recently been completed about 5 or 6 years back. And when I visited, this is an informal squatter community, and when I visited them, they said that in the previous year they had experienced 6 fires in their community and 2 people had died in these fires. Well, what was happening here? It seems, according to the residents of this community at least, that they believe that with the increased value of this land in the aftermath of the completion of the station, a local developer was eyeing this land for a large-scale integrated project, and so, according to them, was using the time-worn and notorious practice of trying to burn the existing residents out of their settlement. Again, I can't confirm that, but that was their interpretation, and it's one that seems to make sense to me. Commodification of urban space. These projects are, again, built for consumer elite within their societies. They're exclusive, and this raises questions about who is going to be able to access and who is going to be excluded from the spaces that are being developed within these projects. Gentrification and segregation. They're conceived as self-contained, and this is really reflected in the way that they're advertised. This is an advertisement for Eastwood City, which is a smallish UIM in Metro Manila. theoretically somebody who lives in one of these developments can leave their condominium unit, drop their kids at school, go to work, go to lunch, or go to the doctor without ever leaving this enclave. And so that raises, for me, the question of what that kind of intense separation between the wealthy and the poor means for the future development of a society. And again, these are societies where historically often the wealthy and the poor have lived in relative proximity. And I think that here in the US, perhaps we're uniquely qualified to pose that kind of question because we have the experience of intensified segregation between different races and different socioeconomic groups in our own urban form, especially with suburbanization during the 60s and 70s, and I think that's had a profound impact on our political and social life. Environmental impacts, these projects have broad impacts on the increase in impervious surface, increase in use of automobiles, broad impacts on ecological systems. Are these environmental impacts being vetted and ameliorated in the same way that they might be in a public sector project? And so the questions that I'm posing about these urban integrated mega projects are essentially focused on, again, the government role, because coming from the perspective of planning, I'm centrally concerned with the role of government and the role of planning and public policy in shaping urban outcomes. And so why has the privatized UIM model emerged as a predominant state strategy in the current era? What are governments trying to accomplish in doing this? What visions of the role of the state and of citizenship are reflected in state efforts to develop these projects? And the final question really gets at the question of community agency, and the question of under what circumstances can communities and citizens really push back against these projects and attempt to assert some control over their impact on urban form. And that component of the research is really focused on a comparative investigation of these projects in 3 cities, Kolkata, Chongqing, Metro Manila, and a broader comparative research on these projects in other cities as well. I won't be able to get into that portion of the research in this presentation due to time constraints. So I'll focus really on those first 2 questions again, looking at the question of why governments are pursuing this and what they're trying to accomplish. Now, before I get into a discussion of some of the answers that I've come up with to these questions, I wanted to briefly touch on some of the literature that exists, that's been written about these new town developments in Asian cities. And in order to give you a sense of the kind of perspectives that I'm trying to inform and to a certain degree push back against. And there's actually not a lot that's been written about these projects, but what has been written has tended to focus on the architectural and urban design aspects and the question of what impact these projects are having on urban form. And so specifically, what's emerged from that is a critique of 2 aspects of these projects: their exclusivity and their supposed Western or Americanized or Disneyfied, in some cases, orientation. Now, and so the kind of gist of the literature is essentially to criticize consumers within these societies for wanting this kind of Western exclusive lifestyle and to criticize developers for delivering that. Now, I'm not entirely in disagreement with this kind of thrust of the literature, but I have 2 problems with it. And the first is that I think this is not always accurate. And especially the critique of these projects as being Westernized or Americanized or Disneyfied is not always accurate. So I think what happens is that we here in the West perhaps are attracted by a narrative that argues that these projects essentially represent a mimicking of the West. And so certain particularly gaudy kind of examples of this tend to come to the fore as the examples that get talked about. So I'll talk about one example here. This is Thames Town outside of Shanghai. I don't know if you had a chance to visit this when you were in Shanghai, George, but it's outside Shanghai, and it's master planned for about 20,000 people. It's obviously modeled on a kind of an old English town. One of the stories that I read about this project is that there's a pub owner in England who is suing the developer of this Thames Town because they've copied her pub. To the details of lampshades and the railing at the bar and things like that, they've actually literally copied the pub. So again, this is, I think, the kind of narrative that tends to come to the foreground. And this project has been highlighted in the New York Times and The Economist. It gets talked about quite a bit. Problem, however, is that so again, Thames Town is part of a larger development called Songjiang New Town, which is master planned for 1 million people. So about 1 or 2% of the population of Songjiang New Town is going to live in this Thames Town. When you leave the gates of Thames Town, go out into the rest of Songjiang New Town, it mostly looks like this. much more utilitarian high-rise. This looks a lot more like Hong Kong or Singapore than it does anything in the West. And so again, I think when we fixate on these particularly kind of gaudy examples of Westernization, we lose the larger narrative. In fact, I've visited maybe 23 to 25 of these projects throughout Asia, and they're actually quite varied in their form, and I think it's actually an interesting question as to what impact they're having on urban spatial development and on urban design and architecture. The second critique I have of this focus on design and architecture in the existing literature is the more important one, which is that I think in focusing on the design of these projects, we've actually disregarded to a large degree an understanding of the social and political context in which these developments are emerging. And I think if we focus more on these social, at least pay a bit more attention to these social and political dynamics that shape the context in which the projects emerge, we'll come to a better understanding of some of their planning and policy implications. So in some of the perspectives that I've developed on these projects, I talk about them under the framework of the privatization of urban and regional planning. And I define the privatization of planning as the transfer of power over and responsibility for the visioning of urban futures and the design, development, and management of urban space from public to private sector actors. Or in some cases, from public sector actors to profit-oriented public sector entities. And so if the function of urban planning really is to envision an ideal urban future and then to strive towards that through some type of policy and planning intervention, what we're seeing increasingly is that that function is being outsourced essentially to private developers. So to give you a sense of what this looks like in a particular urban region, I'll talk about some research that I've done in Metro Manila, and this map comes from an article that was published a couple of years back in Environment and Planning A. It comes out of some research that I did in Metro Manila. And so what you see here is a map of Metro Manila is the gray area. The white area is surrounding urbanizing provinces. And the Metro Manila region is a total population of about 16 or 17 million people. It's a huge metropolitan region. These black splotches here represent these new town developments that have emerged in the Metro Manila region. Let me give you a couple of examples of projects of the Ayala Land Corporation, which is the largest developer in the Philippines. They have projects here in the center of Metro Manila. This is the Bonifacio Global City project that I showed you a rendering of earlier. Further south in Metro Manila and further south still in an adjoining province. Now, one of the interesting things I found in Metro Manila is that the real estate developers are increasingly getting into transportation and other infrastructure development as well. So Ayala Land was involved in building a rail line that links its central city properties up to kind of population centers in the north. It also had plans for a regional rail line to go to the south here. So what I think you see here is, in this case, a single private developer really thinking and acting and shaping the trajectory of urban development on an urban and regional scale. And I would say that these black splotches, the vast bulk of the kind of human and material resources that are being poured into urban development are going into these privatized developments. So they're thinking and acting on a regional scale, attempting to direct urban development into areas where they can profit from that development. And in the Metro Manila context, I'm concerned about this because state capacity to actually plan has been weakened considerably over the years. And so outside of these enclaves, you see a severe deterioration of the urban fabric. So again, I think about these projects in terms of this idea of the privatization of urban and regional planning. Now, let me get on to the answer, or beginning to answer the question of why. Why is this happening? And what are governments trying to achieve through this? In order to begin to answer that question, I think we need to understand the historical context in which these projects have emerged. And I really see them emerging from the confluence of two transformative forces that have really reshaped the economies and societies of many countries in Asia. The first is the pressures for fiscal austerity that many governments have faced. Many of us may be familiar with the fact that in the 70s and 80s, you saw many developing countries especially experience a debt crisis. And they came under a great degree of pressure from the International Monetary Fund, from global banks, to pay back their debts. And so pressure essentially to open up their markets to realize new sources of investment in order to create revenue to repay debts, but also to lower expenditure on social services and urban development. So that's the first context and the first kind of trend. Second is the flood of investment that began to pour into South and Southeast Asia and China beginning in the 1980s. And the seminal moment in Southeast Asia was the signing of the Plaza Accord in 1985, in which the Japanese government agreed to increase the valuation of the yen. And this increased valuation of the yen led to a tremendous offshoring of Japanese manufacturing investment, particularly focused on Southeast Asia initially, and particularly on three metropolitan regions: Bangkok, Metro Manila, and Jakarta, kind of exploded as these emerging industrial regions. The Japanese government also poured a tremendous amount of aid into these cities, these metropolitan regions, in order to bulk up their infrastructure so as to realize the potential for growth that was being created. So one of the things that I've been documenting in some of the more recent research I've been doing in this project is to understand that there are these particular moments, these critical moments, where you see tremendous transformation and turmoil in the governance and in the real estate sector within these societies in order to realize the potential for large-scale infrastructure and real estate development. So again, in Southeast Asia, the critical period is a narrow range of time from 1988 to 1992. During that period, you see the spinning off of land development companies from large conglomerates. You see the incorporation of land development companies. You see the listing of land development companies on stock exchanges. You see these companies engaging in large acts of land purchase. You're seeing governments selling large amounts of land to private developers in many cases, or forming public-private partnerships for urban development. You're seeing deregulation of the real estate sector, for example, to allow for foreign direct investment in real estate. These tremendous transformations which essentially are focused on fostering these opportunities for large-scale developments to emerge. I'm still kind of working on the India and China cases. In India, at least anecdotally, it seems that the period from 2003 to 2005 is the critical juncture where you begin to see a similar set of transformations occur. For example, in China, again, I'm still getting a handle on it, but it seems like there are these critical moments of financial sector reform that really lead to this set of transformations. So that history gives some of the context for why governments are, some of the kind of rationales that emerge within governments to create these privatized enclaves. But why? Why are they doing this? What are they trying to accomplish through this privatization of planning? After all, planning is a function that has historically been very important for governments in terms of political legitimation, political control, social control. And so why would they give up this power, particularly in the context of capital cities? And many of these cities are capital cities. Well, so the next part of what I'm trying to understand is why, and I've come up with some kind of reasons that I think governments are trying to do this, and I'll talk about two of them. There are a number, but these are the two that I think are most important. And specifically, governments are trying to monetize urban land, and they're trying to foster what I term the market-based regulation of urban space, and I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first, the monetization of urban land. The basic dynamic is that governments are under pressure to get urban development done in order to capture investment in a competitive global economy. But they're trying to do that in a way that is either cost neutral or, better yet, cost positive for government. And so you see governments engaging in a variety of machinations, either to try to realize land as a source of direct revenue for the state, or as a source of revenue for the kind of patrons of government in the private sector in order to extend the patronage networks of the state. And so you see a variety of mechanisms, and I think if you looked at 20 different cities, you'd come up with perhaps 40 or 50 different mechanisms that governments came up with to try to realize this turning of land into a monetary asset. The creation of government corporations tasked with privatizing public land, so essentially government land sell-offs. Public-private partnerships between public entities and private sector entities in land development. The aggressive use of powers to expropriate property in the public interest in order then to sell that land or transfer it to private developers. Land reclamation, the actual creation of new land in order to sell that off. I'm going to talk about 3 examples of specific instances of this monetization of land to give you a sense of what this looks like. And again, there are many different models, and each of them has, I think, their own kind of implications for state power, for issues of social equity, for issues of urban form. I'll talk about a couple of particularly egregious examples. The first is Indonesia, in the case of land permitting. What happened in Indonesia, this is, to me, fairly startling and potentially a really tremendous research project to be done in the future, is that in the 1980s and 90s, Indonesia developed this land permitting system in which private developers could apply to the Indonesian government for permits to develop large parcels of land around Indonesian cities. And we're talking about sometimes thousands of hectares of land. Once a developer had one of these permits, they had exclusive rights to develop that large parcel of or piece of land. The existing landowners, the farmers, the small businesses, the residents, could only sell to this one private developer. There was a land valuation committee which would set the value of the land and set it usually above the agricultural price but far below the eventual urban price. And so through this mechanism, the Indonesian government permitted 80,000 hectares of land around the city of Jakarta alone, in the larger Jakarta metropolitan region. 80,000 hectares of land is about the entire land area of the city of New York, and that's just around Jakarta. And so when I mentioned earlier that when we focus on the design of these projects and disregard the larger social and political context, and we need to remember that the political context here was that you had this dictatorial government of Suharto that was in power for more than 30 years. And so much of this is about, I think, a story of these developers, cronies of the government and Suharto, capitalizing on the value of land. When you disregard these kind of social political forces, you miss these larger planning and policy implications. So a lot of the focus of the critique of these new towns that are emerging around Jakarta is on the kind of gated community form that they take, and their Western orientation and their kind of kitschiness. But to me, the real question is 80,000 hectares of land. How many people, massive displacement of populations, a massive reshaping of this entire urban region, socially, economically, politically, and massive impoverishment, I think, a massive transfer of wealth from relatively poor people to relatively wealthy people. And I would love to do a project that really raises the question, what has this meant for the overall regional development of this metropolitan region? Second example, equally egregious but on a smaller scale, is the sale of reclaimed state land. So if you don't have a lot of land to sell to private developers as a state, then you can manufacture new land. And so the reclaiming of land. So the example here is that in Phnom Penh, which is a city of about 1 million people, the Cambodian government has sold the development rights to this lake, Bung Kak, in the middle of Phnom Penh. The Korean developers bought this land, or to-be land, and has plans for a new township on this site. They've begun to fill in the lake. Now, a couple of particular issues with this plan. First of all, there are about 4,000 households living on stilt communities around this settlement. You can see this kind of settlement that actually extends out into the lake. They're going to be displaced. The Cambodian government has an abysmal record of relocating and providing compensation for people displaced in these kinds of circumstances. Second of all, as soon as they began to fill in this lake, you saw tremendous flooding in surrounding communities. This is really an environmental catastrophe that's ongoing in Phnom Penh, at least the last I heard of it, which was about a year ago. This was a major issue. Final example is Thailand, the commodification of state land. So what happened here is that in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, there were a number of state-owned enterprises and government ministries that were essentially bleeding red ink, and they were a tremendous burden on the central government. And so the central government began to incentivize and develop kind of schemes and concepts for these state enterprises and government ministries to capitalize on their assets. And the main asset that many of them had was urban land. Many of them held large tracts of land in Bangkok especially, but other major cities. And so this particular example is the Makassar redevelopment project of the State Railway of Thailand. This is an existing kind of rail car repair and storage facility. So it's not very heavily utilized now. So in that respect, this project is relatively less displacing than the other ones that I mentioned. But their concept is to partner with a private developer to build something like what you see here. And this image comes from a kind of a slideshow that they developed to go around to Japan and Hong Kong and other countries to essentially fundraise for this project. This has not been developed. The only part that has been developed is this rail terminal here. If you take a flight into Bangkok and take the train into the central city, you'll end up in that structure. And that indicates to me that eventually something will be built on this site because this land has become very valuable as a result of the development of this rail terminal. So to conclude this part of the presentation, again, big thing the governments are trying to do is tap into the tremendous potential for wealth generation that's created by this tremendous growth in cities and realize new sources of revenue for government and cronies. The second objective that governments are pursuing that I'll talk about is what I refer to as a market-based regulation of urban space. And so the issue here is that many cities in Asia experience tremendous difficulties with illegal appropriations of urban space. People squatting in public space, people vending in public spaces. You can see this in the image here, the way this community and this market kind of spill out into the road. People are illegally tapping into electricity systems, vending on the street. And so an effort to kind of reassert control over the urban fabric and urban form. In India, for example, some commentators estimate that some 70 or 80% of the population lives in contravention of the law in various ways in the way that they use space, which of course raises questions about the legitimacy of the law itself. But perhaps that's a larger philosophical question than can be dealt with here. So, trying to bring this under control. So, how is this market-based regulation of urban space that is created through these privatized developments supposed to bring the city under control? In order to answer that question, it's useful to understand that there are different kinds of claims that people make to urban space. And as I've thought through this part of my research, I've developed this rough categorization of 3 types of claims to urban space that people employ. The first is a legal claim to urban space, and this is the kind of claim that I think most of us are familiar with. This is a claim that says, I'm going to use this space for this purpose because the law says I can. So I'm going to drag my soapbox out into the square and make a speech because the law says I can do that. A kind of conventional claim that we here in the West might think of. Second kind of claim is a political claim to urban space. Here I'm evoking the work of Partha Chatterjee, an anthropologist who wrote the very influential book, The Politics of the Governed. And in that book, he argues for the concept of political society. And he contrasts political society with civil society. Civil society being that sphere where essentially law-abiding citizens make claims on the state on the basis of norms of citizenship and a concept of citizenship. In contrast, Chatterjee talks about political society as that realm where the poor, who are forced through a variety of circumstances, economic circumstances and political circumstances, to act illegally and to use space illegally, essentially use their numerical superiority. And again, in India, and Chatterjee writes primarily about India, 70-80% of the population is illegal. They use that power of their vote to essentially barter for political protection of their illegal claims to urban space. And so, a political claim to urban space is one that says, I'm going to use this space for this illegal purpose because I know that the government can't stop me, because I'm going to essentially use my power of the vote to claim political protection of my illegal use of space. A social claim to space is one that says, I'm going to use this space for a social or cultural purpose that is protected by larger social and cultural norms. So for example, I'll build a Hindu temple in what is supposed to be a secular park. And I know that the government can't tear that down because they risk the kind of wrath of the larger society if they do so. Essentially what I'm arguing is that in these privatized enclaves, there are no political or social claims to urban space. These get eliminated because there are no political claims to urban space because there is no politics within these spaces. The people who govern these projects are not subject to political control through the ballot because they are privatized entities that operate on a commercial basis. Social claims get obviated because the people who buy into these projects essentially are buying into community as commodity, and to a certain degree they're abdicating their right to make social claims to urban space because they themselves have an interest in maintaining the planned order of these spaces in order to maintain their property values. So I use these two images, a street in Calcutta, and this is a planned development in Jakarta, to contrast this kind of more democratic use of urban space versus this more controlled and commodified framing of urban space. So, in conclusion, I began this presentation by talking about the example of Kolkata West International City. And I posed the question at the beginning of what kind of reconceptualization of urban space was kind of embodied in that project and others like it. I think there are a number of different ways to answer that question. Architects and urban designers might pose questions about what it means to design a kind of a global urban form. The middle class that occupies these projects might pose the question of what it means to be modern and to create a modern lifestyle. I focused on the kind of perspective of urban planners and policymakers. And in my view, this is an important and somewhat neglected perspective. Planners and policymakers, I think, look at these projects, or at least the ones who have been operating within these societies, as a way to empower the role of the state through control of land and through the fostering of a kind of consumer citizenship. I see these kind of changes and the emergence of these projects as part of a larger set of changes that have increasingly captivated sociologists and anthropologists who work on the city. And I think some of the best work on planning and policy making in Asian societies is being, some of the best theoretical work is being done by sociologists and anthropologists, Ai-Hwa Ong, Partha Chatterjee, James Holston. Neil Brenner has influenced my work quite a bit, and he talks about the way that states are essentially trying to restructure, to create spaces, to foster cities as spaces of entrepreneurship and economic growth. So one objective of my research has been to examine the ways that these larger changes that have been explored by sociologists and anthropologists play out in specific Asian cities, specific Asian societies. And I've focused this presentation on these ideas of the monetization of urban land and the market-based regulation of urban space. Each of these phenomena, I think, leads to critical questions for urban planners and policymakers. The monetization of land, I think, raises the question of how we can develop new modes of urban development in a globalizing world that are not founded in exclusion and in violence. So what kind of models of land use planning, of affordable housing development, urban design can ameliorate some of the negative impacts of these projects? Or perhaps should we take a fundamental stand of opposition to these projects because of the dynamics of exclusion and violence? With regard to the market-based regulation of urban space, I think the critical question is how can urban planners and architects, as well as urban designers, re-inject a sense of human agency in urban planning and design? And so my concern there is with a kind of a hollowing out of the social and cultural meaning of urban development through these kind of privatized projects. So I'll finish my conclusion on this project there. Let me very quickly touch on a couple of other things. And so I wanted to finish with this quote, which I think nicely summarizes my sense of the importance of this issue and many contemporary issues in urban development. So this comes from Harvey's book, Spaces of Global Capitalism. It's a quote by Robert Park. If the city is the world in which man created, it's the world in which he is henceforth condemned to live. Thus, indirectly and without any clear sense of the nature of his task, in making the city, man has remade himself. And so fundamentally what I'm asking is, through the development of these privatized projects, how are people remaking their own societies? You're going to have to kind of excuse the gender unneutral nature of the wording of this, but this I think is the fundamental question. So I wanted to quickly talk about my teaching, and I've taught courses in a range of the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. I teach courses on international planning. I teach practice-oriented courses where students actually get out into communities and work with clients to do real projects. Courses on housing and community development. I've taught courses at the PhD level. I've been involved in the development of PhD programs. So I think I can fit in here in a variety of ways. I won't go into any detail on this. Perhaps if you have questions, you can ask them. But I also wanted to talk, and I've had a chance to talk about this with a number of you already, so I'll go through this very quickly. But I'm interested in teaching courses that bring architects and people in the social sciences and public policy together around issues of common concern. And so one course that I developed is called Global Shelter Crisis, which involved myself and a professor in architecture working together to do a combined seminar and a kind of a quasi-studio course where we actually had teams of planners and architects work together to develop interventions for a specific set of informal settlements in Phnom Penh and Brazil. And so this was really focused on this issue of informal or illegal housing. And so we were working specifically on this Bangkok Lake, at least one of the years that we taught this class, that I showed an image of earlier. And so I'd be interested in teaching these kinds of joint architecture and cross-disciplinary classes again. In that respect, a kind of an area of teaching and research that's emerging for me is hazards and the question of hazard resilience and hazard preparedness. And so I'm currently teaching a studio class in which we have a team of urban planning students working with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are helping poor communities to prepare for flooding and earthquakes in Metro Manila. And so this image is of a community leader, a fellow by the name of Kanoli, in the community that we're working with. And they have actually themselves begun to develop very innovative and robust systems of community mapping and community preparedness for disasters that I find extremely compelling. And so part of this is just documenting these community-based efforts that are underway. So what you see here is a pushpin map. You use pushpins and string and a variety of other materials to kind of map out the vulnerability of communities in their, of households in their community. And they're developing a set of interventions. And so we're trying to learn from them, but also inform the way that these types of models might transfer to other communities as well. And I don't have any architects in this class, but the first day of class, the first question I ask is, are any of you architects? Because we really need architectural skills, and so I think there's a lot of potential for collaborative work around this issue of hazards as well. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gavin, fascinating. Random thoughts. I do very little work internationally, but you know, we have here in Boston one of the great examples of displacement by the state in the West End, in which we took a downtown area and we wiped out an entire community using eminent domain. So this is nothing new. The second thing is, it was very interesting, we were noting at the very beginning the number of towns that, including the one, I guess, in Indonesia, or India, where you know you had this beautiful Brandenburg Gate, but nothing behind it. I had an opportunity a few years ago to be in Egypt with one of our faculty here, and we went to their brand new town of Gulf Town. Those were the like 30-foot letters as you enter this, and it is being built, and there are lots and lots of buildings built around a 18-hole golf course in the desert fed by the Nile. But the fascinating thing was there are almost no people there.
Right.
They've built it. Most of it's private development. Gas stations are there. There's a Walmart, I think. The problem they have there is social. People in Egypt live in extended families, and it's very difficult to get a family, a nuclear family, to move without all the uncles and aunts and cousins going with them.
Right.
And so you have people living in these incredibly crowded conditions who could afford the units there, and there were wealthy units along the golf course for millionaires. There was middle-class housing and working-class housing. The only homes that were filled were the ones along the golf course by the wealthy, who only spent the weekends there and played golf, because it's about an hour outside of Congo. So the whole question of the culture must have a major impact on whether this is worthwhile or not. The other thing is, you talked about the role of the private sector real estate developers, not only developing housing, commercial, but even the transportation system. Again, history in Boston tells you that East Boston, across the harbor, was developed by private real estate folks. The only way to make it work was to have private ferries, which they ran until it was occupied, and then they declared the ferries bankrupt and forced the city to take over the ferry service until the tunnels were built. But it has a long history of that. Finally, I was really interested in the comparison of these private developments and the developments I saw last year when I spent quite a bit of time in South Africa around the black townships, where you have new development being put in by the government, and you have new housing literally across the street from these terribly dilapidated townships of hundreds of thousands. But my impression is it's not private developers, it's the state that's doing it. And people are in long queues and in a lottery to get into the new housing. And then finally, again internationally, we had the former mayor of Medellin, Colombia, visiting some time ago, Tufts. And he is a mathematician by training, but loves architecture and had the state build the most modern, most beautiful public buildings, from elementary schools to libraries to universities, and place them not downtown, but in the urban ghettos to revitalize those. And the thing that he did was to, among other things, reduce the murder rate in Medellin to below that of Washington, D.C. So these are I'm just thrilled by what you're doing and the thoughts of how that plays back, including those of us who do work mostly domestically, but how this might play out in other areas of the world where they're trying a different development pattern than what you described here, primarily in Thailand, India, and even in China, where we saw communities that are being built for basically large working class populations, as opposed to the very wealthy Indonesia mansions.
And again, China is so tremendously different because whereas in the Philippines or Indonesia, these are really private developers that are building on this scale. In China, you have, for example, the case that I'm looking at is Chongqing, where you have 8 state infrastructure corporations. And the way that the financing of infrastructure gets done in Chongqing, and let me tell you, there's huge infrastructure development that's taking place, is that the municipality provides land grants to these 8 infrastructure corporations that are responsible for highways and roads and rail lines and things like that. And then each of those developers, or those companies, then build up that land on a commercial basis, and based on that revenue, they finance their infrastructure interventions. So you have a state logic there, but you also have a certain kind of commodified, it's not private sector, but it's a profit-driven logic as well that coexists with that state logic. So China is a fascinating and separate case, and one I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Very quickly, Africa. Excuse me. I have a colleague at the University of Michigan who's looking at these privatized developments in Africa, and they're very much coming up in many African cities as well, Luanda, for example. And he does a lot of work on South Africa. And there's a similar type of privatization of urban space that's taking place in a different way. But what you point to is that it's going alongside these new state interventions in housing and community building as well in that particular case, and that's interesting and worth looking at. I wasn't aware of the case of Boston and the ferries, but people have commented to me in the past that the case of Orange County, south of Los Angeles, there's a parallel there in terms of the development of private sector involvement in building rail infrastructure and kind of pairing that with land development. And so that's something that I plan to look at more in the future. But the bigger question of the kind of cultural dimension of all this is absolutely fascinating. And so in the India case, for example, a lot of the big projects have not moved forward, and even some of the smaller projects similarly are not fully occupied. They're bought out. They're completely sold out, but they're bought mostly by speculative investors. But people are not moving into them, partially because a lot of them are being bought by non-resident Indians from overseas, and people don't want to move into a place where nobody's living there. Half the units on their floor are empty, and so that kind of scares people, that prospect. They're not surrounded by the kind of services that people are used to in an Indian household, and I'm very familiar with Indian households because my wife is from India, and so I kind of have lived this. But you have this regular stream of low-wage workers, the milk delivery person, the newspaper delivery person, the driver, the laundry person, coming to your doorstep constantly to provide you with a variety of services. And that's really built into the social and cultural fabric of that society. When you isolate people in these developments, that is no longer there. The sense of belonging to a larger community, and really that integration between the wealthy and the poor, which people are used to and really draw on as an economic and social resource, is not there. And so whether this model can in fact take hold, and I think the other question, the follow-up question then is, what kind of social change and cultural change would need to happen in order for that to occur, is really interesting. And it leaves open-ended the question of whether these things will ever really take root in the Indian context, which is like the world.
Well, you know, just your last comment, you know what I think about in terms of our Western American culture, we don't have a history of that very strong community culture. And so people could move after World War II into suburbs where they were the first family moving out to Levittown on Long Island, or moving into Oak Park, Michigan from Detroit, because they didn't have those links that you talked about, the milkman, the mail delivery, the newspaper guy.
Right.
And they could recreate that out there. And it may be, when we think about Western forms, it is the failing of these communities to try and adapt Western style to a non-Western culture.
Yeah, but this is first of all, it's very interesting stuff. But I think one of my reactions to it is to think about what is the more compelling. There's a number of issues or problems lurking in what you presented, and for me, I'm not sure that the most discrete or separate issue is whether or not traditional societies, traditional social bonds can flourish in, isolated towers, for example. I mean, I think there are a lot of examples of where those conflicts have existed before.
Mm.
What is more interesting to me is the idea that it's not so much the privatization of development, it's the ends to which privatization is put. And for me, this is always a much more compelling. I mean, for example, just a local example, 15 years ago, they privatized the people who provide skate sharpening and snack serving services at the local rinks. And there were a bunch of people who said, "Oh, this is outrageous." Well, that's not outrageous. The deliverable is very well defined. The public interest is extremely well articulated. I don't care who provides the service, or at least as a citizen, I don't. Now, if I were in that, if I had been the former skate sharpener, I would care. But the point is, that's one kind of privatization, where it's only about the efficiency of the delivery of a service. Obviously, there are larger consequences socially than just the efficiency of the delivery of the service. Nevertheless, that's one sort of privatization. Another sort is what I'm inferring from your presentation is that a city, a representative of government in the Philippines might say, we need to generate cash, period. We don't necessarily have a public interest in mind. We're going to have a big development zone that we hope is going to sell out and house a lot of people, maybe all rich people from even another country, to generate resources that we may then get illicitly distributed and so forth. But that seems like a different question than whether or not development, or whether or not planning is done privately or not. Am I making that distinction clear?
It is. I think that is clear. I mean, I think what's important to me about the idea of the privatization of planning is that implies that essentially, to put it in somewhat abstract and conceptual terms, the kind of citizenship is redefined on the basis of ability to pay. Mm-hmm. So, whereas when you have a government come in and master plan a new area, it can be incredibly displacing and disruptive, although urban renewal was really similarly about clearing area for commercial development. But when you have like a new town that's developed by a public sector entity, there's a political logic to that, but it's not necessarily entirely exclusionary in the way that a commercial logic is, which essentially says that we're going to go purely for highest and best use, and that means a highly commodified development that is going to be targeted almost exclusively at what John Friedman, the famous planning theorist, referred to as the 15% city. That 15% of the population that is the consumer class. And so that results in a very distinct logic of who gets included and who gets excluded. It also results in a distinct logic of, again, the way that the space itself gets regulated in the interest of commercial and corporate profit. So that, again, that, what I try to get is the way that that shapes the spaces in such a way that it really cleanses the city of social and cultural meaning. I don't know if I'm getting it.
Well, I think we're dancing around very interesting stuff here. I guess what I'm trying to get at is how, in response to your excellent presentation, if since this work is in process,
yes.
This is a multivariable problem. One is giving response to your work. Another is seeing how you fit with us and so forth. And I think that the reason I'm drawn to this is that one of the things we're really trying to do as a school of architecture is focus a lot on market-driven development.
Yeah.
Precisely because in this country it is the engine of 99% of that which gets done, and so it's. I'm always trying to get to another level beyond simply private bad, public good.
Yes, and I should say that this is not necessarily developers are evil. A developers are evil story. In fact, some developers have done some very sensitive and good work. Right. But nonetheless, I think the underlying logic in me, the villain, in my mind, the villain really is a government that's opening it up and giving away land. But I didn't let you finish your question.
No. That I mean, my question, comment is, that's the part of this argument that, in my view, needs to get sharpened.
Yeah.
This is wonderful conversation comes out of it. You and I don't get to talk enough about these things. One way to think about it, drawing off you, my economics background, is think of a left-right continuum that goes from private to public.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then think of a vertical continuum that goes from democratic to totalitarian. So you can have public totalitarian. All you had to do was go into East Berlin before '91, as I did. That is not the plan that you want, right? And then you can think along that continuum. You can have private developers who are totally undemocratic. They're just John Friedman's 15%, and they're up here, way up in that quadrant. You have developers like Robert Beal, who's redeveloping downtown Quincy now, working very closely with the community, the mayor, neighborhood associations, and bringing in an enormous amount of capital to a working class community and redesigning it. So I could see a wonderful project in which you could place those communities on that matrix.
So what does a democratic private sector built project look like? So I wanted to quickly give an example, and I don't love this project in terms of design, but this is Mung Thong Thani outside of Bangkok. Master plan for 750,000 people, complete disaster because it was completed right around the time that the Asian financial crisis was really breaking, and so many of these units remained unoccupied. But the designer of this project, an Australian architecture and planning firm, argued that they were trying to develop a model of master planned modern urbanism that was suitable to Thai culture and society. And what they really did is these rather large and ugly blocks, but on the bottom floor they had these rows of shops, small stores, much like the kind of vendors and small businesses, street businesses that you'd see in many Thai cities. And they really opened up the space to create spaces for people to sit. It's not design-wise fantastic, but they did try to integrate the street or create the street as a space for public interaction and the meeting of basic kind of commercial needs, consumer needs. And this project was also pitched at a price range where manufacturing workers could actually afford. So here's an example, I think, of what you're talking about of, perhaps this fits in that part of that matrix that you.
But this requires that the government actually. I mean, this doesn't look like a project where the government is trying to extract money from the society, but rather in making an investment that, even if this is a private development, the government is fostering something that is for the benefit of the people who live here.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, I agree that there is potential, and we should not paint a picture of, again, private bad, public good. But for me, I think the government continues to play a critical role in planning, in ensuring, for example, that transportation systems link these places up to the rest of the city, that the street systems connect, so that people can get into these places from the rest of the city. That the spaces within these cities continue to be democratic in terms of people being able to be there, have access to the spaces, be able to use the spaces in ways that have historically been economically and socially important for them. So just, the way that this rendering I like to show and kind of show the way that it shows it as this project as though it's floating in this empty space and is completely detached from the existing fabric. Well, over here is the main central business district of Metro Manila. Over here is one of the major industrial zones in Metro Manila. This is not apart from the urban fabric, it's in a dense urban fabric. And so the question is, what is the role of government? And private sector developers, arguably by their nature, don't think in terms of these kinds of connections to the rest of the city unless they can directly profit from them, unless they're particularly enlightened. But really, that's the government's responsibility to do that. And so even if we're going to build these things, I think we need to think very critically about the role of the state versus developers in realizing that. And I'm saying all this, I don't think any of this is in contradiction to the point that you're making. I'm trying to kind of, again, being a planner, I'm more concerned about the role of planners.
Well, I mean, the specific choices that were made in the large Manila, the big blocks that you showed us just a minute ago.
Yeah.
Is a great example of where on this continuum you can make different decisions. One of the things that our colleague Tim Love has been very smart about doing in some planning work that he does is encouraging municipalities to consider size limits to street front retail, so that it's just not viable for, rather than say we don't allow CVS to come in, you just say the zoning is that you can't have a store over 1,500 square feet, so you can do whatever you want. If you can do a CVS that's 1,500 square feet, you're welcome to do one.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, it's actually much more viable for the kind of retail perhaps that some places are trying to get that is better integrated, because these decisions aren't always, again, about public or private. They're about homogeneity versus diversity and so forth.
I'm just fascinated by this, and I must say, when I came to the talk, I thought it's going to interest me. The other place I think about is Camagüey, Cuba. Camagüey's right in the middle of Cuba. It was originally all owned by the King Ranch of Texas. It's cattle. It's actually the richest part of Cuba. And when I was there way back in 1980, they were already planning a whole development with new hotels, new commercial areas, low and middle rise, 5- and 6-story apartments, all for workers. Just communist Cuba. But a beautiful, beautiful design and community, and very different than I saw, for instance, in East Berlin.
Right.
And again, the culture made a big difference, both communist, but one kind of a Latin culture versus a Prussian culture.
Right.
And
just to give another quick example of the way that it's not simple to characterize the nature of spaces within these developments, is the case of Manila. The existing central business district is a city called Makati. And that was actually developed before the period that I'm talking about. It's kind of a precursor to the projects that I'm talking about. It was developed by Ayala Land, this one private developer, back in the 60s and 70s. But during the opposition to Ferdinand Marcos that emerged in the 1980s, and there's this massive movement in 1986 in which Marcos was overthrown. He's a dictator who had ruled for many years. But the center of the protests against Marcos was in Makati, in this privatized development, because the Ayalas are actually, I think, a fairly enlightened set of developers, or relatively enlightened. And they did not like the Marcoses, and they didn't like authoritarian rule, and so that was one of the few spaces where they had sufficient control to where they could actually encouraged a lot of the anti-authoritarian movements that emerged during the mid-1980s. And so again, when we talk about democratic versus undemocratic space, it's not necessarily a public versus private proposition.
Gavin, thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. And just very briefly, I wonder, in terms of leverage, you mentioned the 4 issues of displacement, commodification, gentrification, environmental impact. Which of those 4 issues do you think moving forward might gain the most leverage in terms of public-private prioritization of good for the community in the long run? Right now, there's no apparent environmental benefit. The sites are seen as tabula rasa.
Right.
Where is there going to be leverage within these 4 issues for perhaps
Future
someday
action.
positive envisioning of environmental performance or set of environmental services in these developments?
That's an excellent question, and I'd say that I would think the clear answer is the issue of displacement. Because what's happened in a lot of societies is that, governments have been very effective and developers have been very effective at posing these things in positive terms. And in fact, in some societies you see the development of eco-cities, and so this is actually these large-scale master plan developments, sometimes very commodified, are posed as an ecological response to existing urban patterns. And so there are a variety of, those are hard to kind of catch a hold of. But the issue of displacement, has become very controversial in some societies. And most famously in the case of India, there have been a number of efforts by state governments to essentially take large amounts of agricultural land through the use of the Land Acquisition Act, which is this old colonial era act, and essentially turn that over to developers for special economic zones and for new towns. So there's a very case in a place called Singur, in which the elected Communist Party of West Bengal attempted to evict several hundred farmer households. There was a huge backlash against it. There were protests, there were conflicts, several people died in some of the battles that erupted around this. It became a huge political issue. Eventually, that project had to move to another state, but that project actually brought the Communist Party of India down in West Bengal. They had ruled West Bengal for 30 plus years, and they were elected out of power in the next elections because of the controversy surrounding that, and that has actually resonated throughout Indian politics. So these kind of oppositional movements based on displacement have had a tremendous impact. Yeo Tianxing has written about China, and she writes that she estimates that I think she says 50 or 60 million people have been displaced through urban redevelopment projects in the last, I think, 12 to 15 years. But she argues that oppositional movements against eviction for large-scale projects are emerging as a kind of a wedge for government accountability in China. And we can see that through the recent kind of mobilizations in, what was the name of the town, Wuhan, I believe it was called, recall. And so you see that as a wedge for broader political change and not just change to these practices.
And I wonder if there might be a metric at some point that accounts for the cost of displacement of both social systems and environmental systems.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. How do you compensate somebody for,
or not just compensate the party itself or rebuild the wetland itself, but an understanding of the integral role that the person within a community or the wetland within a watershed plays, and disjuncture of that system really screws up the bigger picture. So it's not a populist plea for compensation.
Right.
Rather, it's a sort of a top-down view. How do we realize in this sort of development the long-term costs of considering the tabula rasa versus the different?
Well, isn't that like of the things that a university can provide to this conversation? It's always, I think, worthwhile to think about that. If we're struggling with issues that actually other people who aren't in universities are struggling with just as well or better, that's maybe not the best place for us to aim. But developing metrics for myriad consequences of development, costs of development, across disciplines, seems to me something that would be very, very interesting and useful. In other words, rather than simply say, I don't think this is public enough, or I don't think this is public spirited enough, or if we can lend some, I hate to say it, but if we can try to put numbers on things, we can conceivably make decision-making tools that actually address these things in a more comprehensive way. That's far beyond the scope of this talk, but I mean, seconding the call
Yeah, yeah.
for metrics.
And apologies for having a class, but I very much enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks for coming.
We should probably,
Wrap up.
thank you.
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Thanks.